Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Ideas Matter podcast. My name is Alex,
My name's Louis.
and we're back with you today for a new episode titled What is Liberalism? We're just going to explore some of the key tenets of liberal theory, and the philosophical underpinnings of liberalism, and give some examples of how it works in governments and internationally. We've heard your cries, we've heard your lamentations. We are back with you after an extended break with a new episode. We think this is going to be a good one. It's going to set the stage for a lot of our later episodes, just to give you guys that base knowledge on what liberalism is. So,
So first things first, we apologise about the extended break. We were in Melbourne, Australia, in and out of lockdown, and we were waiting to come out of lockdown. And we did get out of lockdown for 1 week, so we're like, oh, cool. I think we actually got to the point where we booked a recording, didn't we? We booked a studio
yeah,
session.
we did.
And then we went back into lockdown, and that was, I think, almost 5-6 weeks ago now, and we're still in lockdown. So
Has it been 5-6 weeks?
I don't know, man. Time is a blur.
Yeah,
honestly.
probably.
I feel like this sixth lockdown was really the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I'm not sure why.
No, it's the same with me. It's at this point, everything is kind of lost form. Like,
Yeah.
I will blink and it's like a week has gone by. Time has lost all meaning.
That's so true. So yeah, we both just thought like, fuck it. We're not going to be back in the studio anytime soon. So we may as well just buy our own microphones and keep recording episodes online.
Yeah.
Which is what we're doing today. So hopefully there won't be as long a break between this one and the next episode.
No, that's right. And also, hopefully, our audio quality is quite a bit better. For the last one, I was literally recording just off like my laptop microphone. So I think my audio in particular was pretty bad, but got a nice mic now. So do you, Louis. So I think this one should sound a lot better.
I've also learnt not to fiddle with my pen and flick my pen against the table because that does get picked up. So I'm not fiddling with anything today. So that's good.
I thought it added character. It added texture to the audio, you know?
Yeah. It's more authentic. So as Alex mentioned, we're doing liberalism, and this episode is slightly different to our previous ones in that we're not focusing on a singular text. We're focusing on an idea, an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what's the impetus for us having this What is Liberalism episode? Why are we not doing, say, a whole episode on Hobbes' Leviathan? Why are we doing a more generalized What is Liberalism episode?
Well, it's an incredibly influential political philosophy. You know, it pretty much went on to shape all subsequent political philosophy, at least in the West. It went on to shape history around the world, especially in the West and the West's former colonies. And it has continuing relevance today, like the conflict between, say, the US and China currently could be seen as a conflict between liberalism and a non-liberal political philosophy, namely Confucianism, which you know a lot more about than me, and we'll get into that a bit later. But liberalism as an idea, as an ideology, is kind of the prevailing worldview in the West. And to understand our world, we need to understand liberalism. So that's why we're going through this this breakdown of just its key tenets, so we can better understand and have a bit more context going forward in future episodes.
Yeah, I think the point about understanding our world is pretty key, because I think that was primarily the motivation of this podcast. It was the view that philosophy is not this abstract thing that only philosophers and academics do. It sort of starts off that way, but then over time it kind of like filters down into the general public, and people live their lives on these assumptions that they think are not assumptions. They think are just basic truths. But if you were to travel back in time or go to a different culture, they get revealed as being assumptions, and those assumptions come from philosophy quite often. Not always, but in the case of liberalism, it's a very influential philosophy, which has become kind of like the socio-cultural air that we breathe if you like, and it's our political institutions are designed using liberal tenets. So for that reason, I think it's a good illustration of why philosophy matters, why ideas matter, if I dare say.
Ooh.
Um, yeah, a good name for a podcast. But another point that we want to stress and that we believe in very much is that, like, philosophy, as important as ideas are, they don't just fall out of the sky,
Mhm.
right? They're responding to real world events, and they're also shaped by real world events. Um, there's a great quote by this international relations thinker who was into critical theory as well, who said that theory is always for someone and for something. And what he meant by that was that theory is always like trying to answer a question,
Mhm.
and that the question is going to change depending on the social context. So the social context for liberalism is obviously Europe. It comes out of Europe, comes out of the 16th, 15th century, 16th, 17th century, sorry. Um, oh yeah, I might let Alex handle the historical part because you're a bit better versed in that than I am. So what was going on in the 16th and 17th centuries?
So that time in Europe was a time of real upheaval, socially, politically, spiritually. It's around the time of the Protestant Reformation, where, long story short, a schism within the Catholic Church led to a complete breakaway in a lot of territories, mainly around northwestern Europe, where the prevailing religious ideas were still Christian, but moved away from the Catholic Church. They moved towards an understanding that instead of the Catholic worldview, where the Word of God is mediated, um, connection to God rather, is mediated with the average person, the average believer, through the body of the church, through the church hierarchy. Protestants believed that anybody could have a direct experience of God through reading and interpreting the Bible on their own. Um, and this led to a sort of a massive crisis in Europe, where what used to be a fairly homogenous continent, area of the world, at least in a ideological, at least in a kind of religious sense, had a massive sectarian division through the middle of it. This led to many wars. There was a ton of fighting around the time of the Protestant Reformation, such as the 30 Years' War, which, as the name implies, was pretty long. um, and around this time as well, there was the English Civil War, which was partly influenced by the Protestant Reformation, partly through other reasons as well, around political organization, the power of kings versus the power of parliament, where with this backdrop of sectarian violence and intractable worldviews, different ways of seeing the world that can't be reconciled, philosophers were kind of forced to confront the idea of what constitutes a society, what are the first principles of social organization, and how might we organize a society in such a way that this conflict can be avoided in future. Um, it's with this context that liberalism was born, and that's directly out of the English Civil War. You get thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who wasn't himself really a liberal, but he set a lot of the tenets. He looked into a lot of the first principles that will go on to inform liberal theory. You have John Locke, and um, later on you'd get European continental philosophers, not continental in the modern sense in philosophy, but of the continent of Europe, like Rousseau, Voltaire, who continue that liberal tradition. Um, so that's the broad sweep, very broad, very brief sweep of the historical context. It is born out of a time of conflict and people wanting to figure out why this conflict happens and what they can do to avoid it in future.
Yeah, I think that's really the key point when you said it's trying to answer the question, how do we organize
Mm.
society, right? And they want to know how can we organize society because they've been living in so much war and bloodshed for so long. I mean, the 30 Years' War literally, does what it says on the box. It went for 30 years. 30 years of total war. So liberals are trying to go, okay, this is obviously horrific. How can we organize our society so that this doesn't keep happening?
Yeah.
And so they sort of realize the futility of trying to impose one religion over society
Yeah.
because it just wasn't going to work. So that's when you sort of get one of the key liberal assumptions of tolerance, of tolerating other ways of life. It actually came as a practical, if you like, solution to the sectarian violence in Europe. Let's give up on trying to force everyone in France, say, to be Catholic, everyone in England to be Protestant. Are we going to tolerate other ways of life?
Yeah, that's incredibly important. So it's this idea that social conflict around the time of the 30 Years' War, the Protestant Reformation, the English Civil War, was driven in large part by people not tolerating views other than their own. Like you said, Protestant versus Catholic. And the liberal idea of tolerance is, well, we can avoid that conflict by organizing society around the principle that any way of life, any worldview that isn't fundamentally doesn't fundamentally impede the rights of others is acceptable. So long as you're not stepping on anyone else's toes in any major way, you can go about your life the way you want to.
Yeah, precisely. So this is given it's probably its best articulation by John Stuart Mill's harm principle, which, to put it incredibly crudely and simplistically, is that really anything goes as long as you're not directly harming other people. So an analogy is often given that my rights end where your nose begins. So I can hold my hand out in front of your face, but I can't punch you because then I would be harming you and I would be impeding on your rights. So as long as you're not directly harming anyone else, then it's sort of fair game
Yeah.
for liberals. So there are deeper philosophical reasons for the harm principle, and someone who articulates it pretty well is surprisingly John Mearsheimer, who's not a political philosopher but an international relations theorist. So I picked up his work because I was interested in his work from an IR standpoint. He wrote a book criticizing liberalism. Honestly, didn't expect much in way of his analysis of liberalism as a philosophy because IR theorists and political scientists tend to do a pretty bad job at political philosophy in general, I would say. But I was pleasantly surprised by Mearsheimer's grasp on liberalism's core assumptions. What did you make of the Mearsheimer book?
Yeah, I thought it was very good. He was remarkably clear in his writing, in his arguments, and I thought he did a legitimately good job of delving down to the key tenets of liberalism, which, like as you said, I wasn't expecting from someone whose whole career has just been based around IR scholarship.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a nice surprise to because he is, as you said, he's a really good writer. He's remarkably clear. But really, what he says of liberalism, right, is that liberals assume that people are rational. Right, that will sound very, very familiar to most people. Humans are rational. We can make rational choices, but it's a rationality of means, not of ends. And that means that humans can decide what they want, um, and then they're rational in how they get it, but they don't use their reason to decide what they want. And so this most consequentially gets applied to the good life, how to live a moral life. Mearsheimer is talking about when he says that. You can't really reason with people about that. I mean, it's these things are culturally ingrained, they're religiously ingrained. You can't really get to a standpoint of pure objective reason to say this is the best way to live morally in an objective sense. And so liberalism recognizes that limit to rationality. And so it kind of gives up and it just says, well, okay, we're not gonna impose any one system on other people. The only system we are going to impose is that you have to tolerate all these different versions of the good life, as long as these versions of the good life are not impinging on one another, right? But the assumption here is that like human rationality is a rationality of means, not of ends. I think he calls it instrumental rationality.
Yeah.
We have instrumental rationality, but not, like David Hume articulates this pretty well. Like the reason is and should be the slave of the passions. It's our passions, it's our emotions that determine our morality to a large sense. It's not our pure objective reason.
Mm. And we're not going to delve too deeply into criticisms of liberalism in this pod. We're going to get to that mainly in future episodes. But that idea of kind of instrumental rationality, that the good life is ultimately something of the passions, then of the intellect, then of the rational mind, becomes a very large target for critique of liberalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I am devoting the next year of my life to critiquing. So don't worry, we will be getting into that at a later date. But we should probably backtrack from there because really the first assumption of liberalism is first and foremost individualism.
Yeah, that's really the key first principle upon which all the other principles of liberalism are built upon.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one comes more directly out of the English Civil War and out of Hobbes's writing in Leviathan, where he talks of people existing in a state of nature. Um, and I just want to say a few words about the state of nature because it's sort of misunderstood or it's straw manned. Like the easiest straw man to say is, well, humans never really existed in a state of nature, like Hobbes said. So therefore, the whole thought experiment makes no sense. Hobbes would agree with that, and so would Locke, right? This thought experiment that humans are existing isolated as individuals in a state of nature, not being members of families, not being members of tribes, like all that comes later in the state of nature. You enter into social relations later on to maximize your utility for whatever reason, be it survival, enjoyment, food, whatever. Um, Obviously, that's ahistorical because you're born into a family, you're born into a tribe, you're born into a context. We were never isolated individuals in a state of nature. But these liberal state of nature theorists would recognize that what this really is almost like an essentialist argument to say that if you were to strip away all of your social relations, all of your historical, cultural contingencies, what would be left? And the liberals would say what would be left would be the individual. And that is who you essentially are. You essentially are an individual. And so, therefore, you are the individual. Your identity is as an individual, not as a British person, not as a Protestant, etc. Not as a man or a woman. You are essentially an individual, and therefore it is the individual who is our moral unit of concern. It's individuals who should be protected. It's individuals who carry rights, and it's individuals that we are primarily concerned with. And that comes out of the state of nature
Yeah.
theorists.
And we can also, taking a longer view, see this idea, this centrality of the individual as something that's kind of uniquely European and uniquely Christian in its intellectual origins. Um, you look at the political philosophies, um, just understandings of the self that arise out of other parts of the world in different traditions, such as say China or India, where there's a much broader sense of what constitutes the self, of what constitutes the kind of basic building block of society. So, in say the Chinese context, that would be, or at least in the Confucian context, that would be the family. But due to the massive influence of Christianity in Europe, Christianity holds that each individual is endowed with a unique soul, and that soul belongs to them and is essentially their essence. No pun intended, essentially their essence. um, Now, this was present in Catholicism. Just to get into a little bit of touching on theology, it was this idea of the individual soul was present in Catholicism, but Catholicism was almost necessarily communal. Like I mentioned earlier, your relationship with God happens through the community of the church. So there's never really this isolation that we will see with the liberal philosophers and their understanding of what the individual is. Now, as I mentioned, when you get to the Protestant Reformation, there's suddenly this idea that the individual has a direct relationship with God. You don't have to commune with God through the body of the church. You can have a direct relationship with God through, on your own, reading and interpreting the Bible. So it's up to you to interpret God's word. So suddenly the onus of spiritual life shifts from a communal one to an individual one when you get the Protestant Reformation. Um, and with that shift in the kind of onus of spiritual life, that also coincides with the shift in the onus of moral life. You know, morality is no longer necessarily a communal matter as it was through, say, the body of the church, because the individual in Protestantism is interpreting the word of God. It is up to you, therefore, to interpret morality, which is why you get to this idea of like the individual and tolerance. That's kind of the broad view of how we get to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point to say that the onus of morality
Mhm.
gets shifted to the individual, because it's not just, as I said, that like individuals are the ones to be protected. Um, they're also, under certain interpretations of liberalism, at least, the ones to be blamed when things go wrong, because you are responsible now. You have a moral responsibility, which comes along with that rationality. And so this manifests today in a lot of liberal policy, right? We will help people, sure, we'll have a welfare state. But if you make bad choices that you were allegedly free to not do, so you weren't, let's just say, someone who wasn't born with a severe disability, who wasn't born into a disadvantaged community. They just make a free choice, air quotes, a free choice to do something that might not be a wise decision. Say they become a drug addict, for example. Um, on a hardcore liberal view, on a classical liberal view, I mean, they've failed as a moral agent, and therefore they shouldn't really expect society's support from that. So yeah, I mean, this is sort of foreshadowing criticisms a bit, but this idea that individuals are the moral units is a two-sided coin, right? It's, yeah, you should be protected as an individual, but also you now have individual responsibility to ensure that you live your life in a good way.
Building on from the individual, there's a view in liberalism that individuals have inalienable rights. By inalienable, I mean rights that can't be taken away or given up. So, say theoretically, you have the right to determine how you live your own life. You have a right to freedom, essentially, and in that right, from a theoretical standpoint, say you can't sell yourself into slavery because that right to freedom is inalienable. You know, you can't give that away to others, and conversely, others cannot take that away from you. And this idea of inalienable rights is very influential in liberalism through to the forming of a lot of governments around the world. For example, in the preamble to America's Declaration of Independence, they explicitly reference this. The Declaration of Independence is like an explicitly liberal document. Here's the quote: "We hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." So there we go, there's the Christian connection. "That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So, just kind of in a nutshell, that's like a very brief sentence long encapsulation of what liberalism means, essentially.
Yeah, I love the Declaration of Independence. I did the American Revolution at school, and tragically, I memorized like I think half of it.
Oh, hell yeah.
I mean, it's a beautiful document, and
It
quite
is
funnily,
very,
like,
it is very like poetically written. It does feel kind of inspiring, but when you contrast it with the actual workings of the United States government throughout its history, it leaves a
Mm.
bit of a sour taste when you read it.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point because something that you always hear from people who are so like steeped in liberalism, but then would quite readily acknowledge the failures of liberal societies. Something that you very often hear is, "Well, this is because we haven't taken liberalism seriously enough. We haven't extended it to enough people, right?"
Mm,
So, slavery being like the best example. It wasn't a failure of liberalism per se. It was just that we didn't like include African American slaves in the definition of who is created equal.
yeah, we weren't
Um,
liberal enough.
yeah, we weren't liberal enough. We just need more liberalism. We need better liberalism. That's something that we can like touch on touch on later because that's a very very common refrain that you'll get from liberals.
Yeah.
But yeah, that quote really does like is very very indicative, particularly the part where it says endowed by their creator, right? Because Hobbes didn't so much talk about rights; he was just mainly talking about individuals in a state of nature. So that's where you get the atomized individual assumption. But Locke also talks about the state of nature, but he talks about individuals in a state of nature as having natural rights under natural law. And really, what he means by that is like humans have God given rights because they're like created in God's image, right? So when he says natural, like he doesn't mean like nature per se. He means like the universe and God. God has created us as such. So there is this, very much intrinsic like connection with Christian or religious metaphysics. Um, but rights, I mean, and if they're given to you by God, then yeah, presumably they can't be taken away,
Mm,
right? How could a human take away something that God has given you? It doesn't make any sense. But a potential problem for liberalism is like, do its assumptions hold up in an increasingly secular society? Um,
mm,
Again, something that we can potentially discuss at a later date. But I think going from the rights are something that you have a priori, you have them intrinsically, essentially, before you enter society, right? But then also equally important to this idea of liberalism is the idea of a social contract. So, unlike communitarians, for example, who might say if they believe in rights, like rights are given to you by your community, they're like an epiphenomena of a social context. Liberals say no, they're a priori. So then the question arises: well, then why do we have society? What's the purpose of society? So Hobbes and Locke say that people enter into societies, they form a social contract to gain some form of utility. So it's basically a rational cost benefit analysis of why people form societies. I'm going to get something out of this. And I might forego some degree of freedom because I'm no longer, I don't know, a savage living in the wild, being able to do whatever I want, but I'll get something back in return, i.e., protection, more food, etc. So you have this social contract, and that to liberals is like the theoretical basis for society.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like Hobbes outlines this very specifically when he goes through his state of nature. Um, this kind of idea of a state of nature leads naturally into the idea of a social contract in liberal theory. Like you were saying, for Hobbes, in a state of nature, everybody might have complete freedom, but the freedom of one person might mean the death or the starvation of another person. So, in this context, a social contract is I give up my right to be able to say, kill you and take all your things, but in turn, I have gained the right to not be killed and have my things taken away from me. It's this kind of mutually beneficial curtailing of freedoms.
Yeah, and this is what Isaiah Berlin calls negative freedom or negative liberty, right? It's a freedom from rather than a freedom to. So you and I have both gained a freedom from each other in a certain sense. I no longer fear as much as I did that you will just walk into my house and kill me and take everything. So I have a freedom from violence, for example. So this is what Isaiah Berlin, who's a 20th century thinker, calls negative liberty. There's also positive liberty, which is associated with some forms of liberalism, say progressive liberalism, but more so socialism. Right? You have freedom to something or rights to something. It's just like the right to healthcare, the right to education, right? This is not just that like I owe you not to do something to you, but I also should do something to you. I should help you get education. I should help you get healthcare. Not merely just like restrain myself from my desire, my latent desire allegedly to kill you and take all your stuff. Um, so classical liberalism, errs more on the side of just like negative liberty, just stopping people from killing each other.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And in order to do this, to uphold um, the guarantee of rights for everybody, um, liberals recognize the need for a state, for like a sovereign government to maintain public order. So without something to guarantee these freedoms, well, the society would pretty much fall apart. So there has to be something. There has to be something in this society that has enough power, that has, if you will, a right to violence to make sure that these rights continue in society. And that's where the state comes in liberal theory. Um, so the state, well, there are different kind of understandings of whether or not the state should have complete monopoly on violence in liberal society, or if the state should have a near monopoly on violence. You can look at the American, oh God, I don't know, my American politics, if it's the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, with the right to bear arms.
I think that's in
So
the Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights. Yeah. So it's this understanding, at least in the American liberal context, that in case the government gets too powerful, the individual has a right to take up arms to fight back against the tyranny of that government, to maintain those rights. But there's this just kind of, even with that, there's this understanding that, okay, we will give the right to violence to the state to make sure that our rights-based society can continue. Um, so pretty much the state enforces those rights and punishes those that infringe the rights of others. So this is pretty straightforward. Think of like, I don't know, a murderer. A murderer back in the day would get executed, or these days would get sent to jail because, well, they took away the rights to life of another person. And of course, if we let that go unchecked, if we just let anybody murder anyone, then our liberal rights-based society would fall apart. So there has to be this organ in our society, this kind of central pillar that has the right to strike down anyone who digresses too far out of the bounds of what we deem acceptable in our society.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is here, right? I mentioned before the social contract. How do you stop someone from breaking a contract? You need someone to enforce it, and so that's the role of the state. The way I think of it is, I've converted my brain purely into Simpsons references. By the way, there's an episode where like Bart and Lisa are fighting, and they're like swinging their arms trying to hit each other, and Marge steps in between them and holds them apart by their heads, but they keep swinging, right? So like Marge is like the liberal state; she's the night watchman state, and Bart and Lisa are liberal individuals who are like rationally trying to pursue their self-interest, right? But if they keep doing that without regard for one another, they're gonna collide. So you need a state to come in and to sort of like almost push people apart in a sense.
That's a phenomenal example.
Yeah,
That actually
right.
illustrates it very clearly. That's we should use Simpsons references more in this.
Yeah,
We should have required watching, required episodes to understand our.
well, Einstein said that if you can't explain something to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it. I would posit that if you can't convert it into a Simpsons reference, you don't understand it.
That is a great axiom.
Yeah. Okay. So your Marge is, holding Bart and Lisa apart to basically stop them from infringing on each other's rights. In this case, it's the right to not be harmed. But again, this goes back to the view that like liberals are skeptical of the state's ability to determine what the good life is.
Mm-hmm.
So individuals can make contracts with one another, and the state enforces those contracts. But on a very hardcore classical liberal view, the state doesn't really have much to say about what is in those contracts,
Yeah.
um, because it's liberals are skeptical of our ability to tell others how to live their life. But again, this comes from the assumption that like humans are rational, right? It sort of assumes that society is a level playing field, and you and I can enter into a contract as two equals. And I'm just looking at your notes here, and something that we haven't touched on is like the presumption of equality, that everyone is equal, but it's equality in a nominal sense. Like it's equality on paper. You and I are equal, and we have equal rights. But what if you are, you have an IQ of 140 and I have an IQ of 90, and you're my boss and you want to sign an employee contract with me, right? Like if I'm severely intellectually disabled, yeah, sure, we're both equal on paper, but that's not really going to be a fair contract. And so these sort of like natural endowment differences is what philosophers call them. Liberalism doesn't really do a good job at dealing with that. I mean, the same can be said of like gender and race and historical injustices. Yeah, people are equal on paper and they enter these contracts. But what happens when these contracts and these societies are founded upon power indifferences? It doesn't matter if you just say, yeah, women are equal to men. Okay, yeah, sure. We all believe that now. But there might be an underlying power difference that like liberals are not particularly good at dealing with using their own language. Um, that's just a few words on the liberal conception of equality. It's called formal equality or nominal equality.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. So it's equality in the sense that um, if pressed, just kind of like on paper, there's an understanding like, yeah, I'm equal with this person, but there's no action on the part of the state to level the playing field to create a kind of a material equality between people.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't do that, right?
Yeah,
Because at least according to classical liberals, because once you do that, you're making decisions about how best to allocate resources. And when you're deciding how best to allocate scarce resources, you're presumably making a value judgment about what should and shouldn't be helped. And that would violate like the neutral principle, right? That the state should be neutral on the best way to live your good life.
yeah, for sure.
The best illustration, I think, of this actually comes from a Chinese IR scholar, Yan Shitong, who's talking about liberalism and liberalism's like notion of equality being like super formal and very superficial. He's talking about it at the international level, but he gives an example from the domestic level as well. Everyone in liberal societies has the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, and everyone has the right to be heard before a court of law. On paper, we're all equal in that sense. But if I'm poor and I want to accuse someone really rich of having harmed me in some way, the fact that the rich person can afford the best lawyers in Australia, and drag out the court case until I go bankrupt and effectively prevent me from accessing justice, I think is a really good example of showing how liberal equality is purely formal. It can't recognize those kind of like tangible differences that might affect its theoretical application.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a phenomenal example. Um, and kind of just branching off that understanding of the state, the state should be neutral. There's also an understanding about among liberals that the state also just shouldn't have too much power. So kind of baked into liberal political theory are different ways that the state can be limited. Government is kind of cut back in a way that ensures that it can't impede the rights of others. And we can just see this very clearly in a lot of our current political institutions. So the idea of checks and balances in governments. You have an executive, you have a legislative branch, and you have the judicial branch. And all of those are supposed to balance against each other. So one cannot gain more power than the others and skew the balance of power, and thus skew potentially the ability of rights to be upheld in a fair way. Or also, the idea of federalism. In Australia and America as well, we have federal styles of government in which, yes, we have a kind of a federal government that does have quite a bit of power, but we also have states, and the states themselves have power that is independent of and cannot be impeded by the power of the federal governments. So there's ways to break up the power of governments so that it cannot bear too heavily upon the rest of society.
Yeah, I mean the checks and balances is a good example. I did this reading yesterday. It was William Kymlicka, who's a political philosopher, who wrote about liberal neutrality, and he made the point that like liberalism is not as neutral as people think it is.
Mm.
Um, it's neutral in a he says it's neutral in a justificatory sense, justification, right? So you can't justify a policy by saying it's going to help this version of the good life more than others. But it isn't neutral in consequentialist terms, right? And so the example he gives is like, it's not that liberals have this like moral scale and that they find that all ways of life are equally valuable according to that scale. It's that they don't have a scale at all, um, and that they think the best way that these questions should be solved um, is in a free marketplace of ideas, right? So people come together and they have this contestation of ideas, and the best ones are going to win out, right? And so that's the same reasoning behind checks and balances in government. If you have this dictator, then you're only going to get a very narrow conception of how society should be organized. But the more friction and tension that you introduce into the system, the more likely it is that, like, from this creative tension, you're going to get the best way to live, right? And so this idea that the best ideas will win out. Then Kymlicka makes a really, really good point where he says that, okay, that's wonderful in theory, but what this creates is a bias towards those who are articulate.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that being articulate is not an individual variable. Like, there are groups in society who are less articulate. So, say, like refugees who can't speak English or who didn't have the benefit of being educated, they're not going to be able to defend their ideas in a public square as well as someone like you or I. And so liberals might like to think that, like, this free marketplace of ideas is going to give you the best result, the best ideas in how to organize society. But it still has in its operation, it has these biases.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. And we are talking about checks and balances, but I just want to bring up, no one ever wants to talk about Slovaks and balances.
No. Dude, that joke makes so much more sense if people know that your heritage is from Slovakia.
We have to leave it as is and have a random European ethnic jokes.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point on what is it, Kymlicka,
Mm.
about the abilities of people to actually participate in the marketplace of ideas and kind of uphold their rights in that way. And speaking of marketplaces, there is another very central tenet of liberalism that becomes really the most common criticism of it, at least from the left, which is that, along with this kind of idea that people can freely participate in a marketplace of ideas, there's this idea in liberalism that people can freely engage in economic activity via markets, so that, everybody can pursue their own, rational self-interest through economic means, and that the sum of this economic self-interest pursued by rational individuals is greater prosperity for all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point in particular is fantastic. Like, it's would be kind of uncharitable to say that liberals don't believe in the social good or the common good. They just believe that, like, whatever the social good is, it's merely the aggregate of, like, individual interactions. And so it would be wrong to, like, limit individual freedom in service of the quote unquote social good, because the social good is whatever the sum total of individual interactions give you. And so in the marketplace, like, the best result is that which the market determines, assuming that the market is operating in a way that like liberals would recognize as being fair and free. I think a lot of contemporary neoliberals would be shocked if they actually read Adam Smith, but anyway, we won't go into that. But yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, right? Sort of like free markets and capitalism are just an extension of
Yeah.
liberal logic.
Yeah, yeah, just like you have the right to freely associate with whoever you want to and freely state your ideas in whatever way you'd like to as well. You have the right to freely engage in economic activity. That's just a natural extension of this liberal idea of rights and freedoms.
Yeah. So economic contracts are those contracts which the state is merely enforcing, which can become kind of contradictory in practice for liberalism, because you said that like the state, its power should be limited, right? We should restrain the state as much as we can, but sometimes upholding like economic contracts, particularly if those contracts are international in scope, right? International trade agreements, or owning property in other countries, upholding those contracts requires a very, very powerful state.
Mhm.
And so this is a problem for liberalism. Um, yeah, I mean, you wanted to talk about liberalism internationally, and I think that is where it first kind of gets going, is when this free market idea gets extended to free trade, and you start like engaging in free trade across with the whole world, and then you're signing these contracts with other cultures and other societies. Okay, well, how does the state then enforce all this? And then you get the birth of what I think is like liberal international relations.
Mm. Could you go a bit more into that? Because you are a real IR aficionado. You're currently studying IR at a master's level, and you're going to go into a PhD as well. Safe to say you know a lot about this. So I feel like it'll be very illuminating for the audience if you could delve a bit deeper into the implications of liberalism for international relations, for global politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say about that is that liberal IR is domestic liberalism writ large, right? So the anarchy, the state of nature that's observed by Hobbes and Locke within domestic societies still exists at the international level, because there is no world government, there is no world state that can impose order and enforce contracts. So the first thing to say is like the conditions observed by Hobbes and Locke exist still to this day internationally. So that's the first point that liberal IR would point out, and realists would agree with that as well. But what's interesting is, what is the liberal solution to this inherent violent tendency and tension in human relations? Um, it's to enter into a social contract and create a government, but there's a deeper theoretical justification, and that is, if I meet you on the street, I don't know you, I don't trust you, right? So it's sort of like a game theory scenario kicks off, where we're both trying to calculate, okay, what's the best chance of survival here? What do I do? That sort of calculus diminishes over time if I keep running into you, right? So we develop trust. I get to know you, and sort of our interactions become more predictable, right? So you need to have iterated social interactions. And so in the domestic context, you create like a society, a social system in which people's interactions, even if we don't know each other, are governed by laws and norms that we know. And so that enables us to develop trust. At the international level, that just doesn't exist. So when we were talking before we started recording about Britain and the Opium Wars with China, when Britain rocks up to China, like they can't trust one another. You have this game theory, survival calculus kicking off in both actors' heads. So the liberal international solution, this is sometimes called liberal institutionalism, is where we need to make international interactions as iterative as they are within domestic societies. So we need to institutionalize international politics. We need to create things like the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. We need to create rules and norms that are enforceable, so that our interactions become predictable, trust is developed, and the security dilemma, is that like country A starts building a military for purely defensive purposes, but because country B can't read their mind and doesn't trust them, it makes sense for them in a game theory sense to interpret it as offensive and to in turn build up their own military. But then that has a kick-on effect, a feedback loop, if you like, where country A views country B's defensive build-up as an offensive build-up, and so they increase their own build-up, and it sort of spirals out of control. So the way to get around that, according to liberal IR, was if we institutionalize these interactions, we can enable trust to develop. The best example probably is the European Union. After World War II, how do we stop Europe from tearing itself apart again? The liberal institutionalism was very, very influential in setting up the European Union. France and Germany tore each other apart for hundreds of years, but today it is unthinkable that they would go to war against each other. So the European Union is the best example of liberal IR, I think.
Mm-hmm. And what does liberalism have to say about those who aren't liberal? This kind of has, domestic implications, but I feel like it has sort of a greater relevance internationally. So what's the liberal view of those who aren't liberal, and what's the kind of tendency for how liberals interact with those who aren't liberal?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Because yeah, I mean, liberals tolerate others, right? But it's kind of like a tolerance within a bounded set. You don't tolerate non-liberals because non-liberals threaten liberalism. If you tolerate someone who's not going to tolerate you, your tolerance is kind of impotent and you're not going to last very long as a society. So liberals don't tend to extend their liberal tolerance to non-liberal societies. There's this fundamental mistrust. Immanuel Kant is usually regarded as like one of the first liberal IR thinkers because he spoke of despots, and he was talking quite explicitly about like Asian societies when he was writing this. He said, I think that like they're at war with their own people because they don't give them rights, and so how can we trust a government or a society which is already at war with its own people? That's just going to carry on into its relations with us. So there's a fundamental mistrust, and also in a way, they don't extend the liberal idea of rationality to other societies, right? Like consider how, I guess, the way that the United States treats Iran, because it is like on paper a theocracy. They're not as rational as we are, right? We can't trust them to operate in the international system because we've not extended this liberal view of rationality to them. They're not rational actors. So yeah, it puts in, I think, I mean, this is my opinion, puts in this fundamental level of like tension and friction and mistrust into the international system because liberal societies and liberals view all other people and other societies in a state of pre-liberalism. And there's two responses to that. You either ignore them, right, and like just be a light on the hill, and that has a very strong appeal in certain strands of American thinking. The other strand of thinking is, well, these like non-liberal societies are a threat to our own way of life because if we're tolerant and they're intolerant, they pose a threat to us. So we need to actively make them liberal. And this is where liberal internationalism kind of can start to look like neoconservatism. It becomes very like evangelical in spreading its views across the world in a desire to make the world safer for liberalism.
So in its kind of more violent, more kind of missionary form, there's a sense of almost imperialism to liberalism. The logic of liberalism, yeah, at least in one line of argument, means that liberalism has to be extended to those who aren't liberal, and if that has to happen through violence, then so be it.
Yeah, pretty much. And again, it's a contradiction of liberalism, right? Because on the one hand, it says, well, humans can't decide on the good life, so therefore we shouldn't impose any one vision because it's basically beyond the bounds of reason. But again, that's like only within a bounded set. It's kind of, frankly, only within people who look and sound like and think like us. So it's sort of a limited extension of this idea of tolerance, right? And so the state, on the one hand, shouldn't enforce certain ways of life But then internationally speaking, when you have societies who exist beyond the liberal frame, then all of a sudden it should. Because it believes, one, that like rights are universal, right? They're given a priori. Humans are not defined by their ethnicity. So like an Afghani woman, she still has inalienable human rights to a liberal. Just because they're not recognized by the society she lives in doesn't mean they don't exist. And so it's an affront to liberals that they're being violated. Um, but the question is, well, what do you do about that? Do you go in to this society and try and get them to see the light at the end of the tunnel, which is liberalism, and get them to all become like, quoting the Declaration of Independence? Like, how do you deal with that problem? Um, and that's the whole point of the Mearsheimer book. He goes, well intentioned as this might be, it's a recipe for disaster at the international level because it's going to create wars.
Mm. Yeah, that's kind of neatly goes into a critique of liberalism, which is that in liberalism's presumption of kind of universality, the presumption that there is a liberal in everybody else, even if they haven't kind of developed liberalism yet, you are justified in going in there and spreading it. But that act of going into a country, of invading a country and through violence opposing those who oppose liberalism, you just create a stronger reaction against it. So it's kind of, we can just see this in the example of Afghanistan. The United States went in there and attempted to set up a liberal democracy, but that failed to such an extent that the Taliban, the organization the United States went in there to remove from government, is now back in complete control due to the failures of that American invasion and experiments at liberal democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think you can disconnect what's also going on today in the former Soviet bloc from the failures of liberalism, because when the Soviet Union collapsed and all these states became like notionally like capitalist and liberal, whatever, um, it didn't really work at improving like the. I mean, it sort of did. I mean, you know more about this than me, but like Russia in the 1990s, right, when it became a capitalist, it was just a human tragedy, right? And so people, rightly or wrongly, associated this huge deterioration in their living standards with the imposition, what was perceived to be a foreign imposition of these ideals on their societies as being the reason for their misery. And the same can be said of Afghanistan. Like, the government that the United States propped up was notoriously corrupt, right? So people began to not trust them. And I've read many examples of people who, don't like what the Taliban stands for, but they viewed them as being less corrupt than the American backed government. So yeah, I mean, there is this like empirical contradiction to this like strand of liberalism where it just like is not good at doing what it says it's doing. It has the opposite effect, as you said. It makes people less liberal.
Yeah. On Afghanistan, it seems to me, just from my kind of limited understanding of it, that it really neatly aligns with like what Hobbes was talking about, with the state of nature being a place of a condition of like anarchy and violence, and that in the state of nature, people will defer to a leviathan that is like an incredibly powerful government with a complete monopoly on violence to kind of mediate that chaos and prevent it from spreading. So we can kind of see that in the example of this notoriously corrupt liberal democratic government that was backed by the US, did an incredibly poor job of actually governing Afghanistan. And well, whether or not people actually agree with the Taliban, they saw it as an entity that is able to exert control and power to such an extent that you would no longer have the ongoing conflict, the ongoing violence that Afghanistan has suffered for so long. It seems to me like a pretty neat and succinct example of what Hobbes has been trying to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And the reading that I did last night, I'm not sure if it's like Kymlicka. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. But
It looks like a Czech last name.
Oh, really?
It's it'd be something like Kymlicka, but I don't know. Given that he's like, what is he, like Canadian or American?
Yeah, he's
Probably
North
he probably
American.
would pronounce it like Kymlicka.
Yeah, Kymlicka made this good point in the reading that like liberals tend to assume that like tolerant liberal societies, once they exist, are self-sustaining, and so they tend not to pay much attention to the conditions which enabled their emergence. So they kind of forget Hobbes's observation that you need a strong state to enforce these things. You need order before you can begin talking about, civil liberties, free speech, freedom of religion. You need to have the freedom not to die, and so you need a strong state. And sometimes liberalism sort of forgets where it has come from. It forgets its founding blocks, which I think neatly sums up like what I think of liberalism. I think liberalism is a great place to start, but a horrible place to finish. I think if your view of political philosophy starts and ends with liberalism, you're missing a lot out. You're missing out all these flaws, all these biases within it. But at the time, liberalism was a very progressive ideology. But that doesn't mean that we should stop there.
Hmm. Yeah, and one of the largest and most influential critiques rather of liberalism, Marxism, does exactly what you suggest should be done, which is they start with liberalism. They start with the idea that individuals are free and have an inherent dignity and they have rights, but it ends not where liberalism ends, because they saw inherent contradictions in liberalism and the capitalism which goes hand in hand with it. They thought, well, no, this has to be extended, and that extension rather ends in socialism. That's one of the big critiques. We're going to get to that in a later episode, but I just thought it was worth pointing out now that there are political philosophies that use liberalism as a basis but move well beyond it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting, discussion about whether or not Marxism is just an offshoot of liberalism. Um, yeah, I'm of the view that it is, to a lesser extent than something perhaps like communitarianism. Marxism probably goes a lot further, but they're both Western. They're both offshoots of liberalism and liberal thought, and the problems that they were trying to address were broadly similar. Although Marxism expanded its sphere of concern into economic alienation, blah 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 blah. But yeah, we'll go into that at a later date.
Right. So I feel like we've kind of just covered everything we need to cover with liberalism. We've gone over all the key tenets, the individual rights, social contracts, tolerance, a state, but a limited state. We've also looked at it internationally and indicated toward a couple criticisms of liberalism. And this leads us nicely to our next episode, which is going to be, what is communitarianism? Now, we've touched on communitarianism. I believe it's in our first episode with Charles Taylor. He's a communitarian political philosopher. But we're going to kind of expand our discussion of it. Charles Taylor is just one thinker in a broader tradition. We're going to look at that broader tradition, which is, in a very direct sense, a response to the failures of liberalism. So, in the next episode, we're going to address very deeply a number of critiques of liberalism and suggest towards a different political philosophy that addresses these critiques.
Yeah, I think communitarianism is really trying to save liberalism from itself to a certain extent. So that would be very, very interesting to see, and something that people should bear in mind. What I will be reading in preparation for next week's episode is Communitarianism and Its Critics by Daniel A. Bell, and also the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on communitarianism, recently edited also by Daniel A. Bell, which is more of a modern update on his thoughts on communitarianism. So they'll be the main resources that we'll be drawing on, just in the interest of transparency. He's certainly not the only communitarian thinker, but one who I think is the most interesting.
Yeah. And I've one of the communitarian texts I'm familiar with, which is called After Virtue, A Study in Moral Theory by Alistair McIntyre. I'll have another kind of touch on that. I'll refamiliarize myself with it Just so I feel like it'd be valuable if we get those multiple perspectives on what communitarianism should look like. Daniel A. Bell goes at it from a Confucian standpoint, whereas McIntyre goes at it from an Aristotelian standpoint, that is the philosophy of Aristotle. So I feel like it'd be useful if we can look at how different philosophical traditions can be used to critique liberalism and still end up at relatively similar conclusions.
Yeah, definitely. Relatively similar conclusions, despite different, I guess, intellectual, philosophical resources, is something that Daniel Bell in particular is very, very interested in. So yeah, we look. Hopefully, that shouldn't be too long. Perhaps maybe 2 weeks for the next episode. So I look forward to hearing from you all then.
And as always, please send feedback and suggestions. If there's any episodes that you want to see, that would be very helpful to stop us from having to think of what episodes we should do next. We're always open to suggestions, unless you
true.
say you want us to read like a 900-page book, like you want us to read like all of Hegel. Like we can do, maybe we can do a bit of Hegel, but I don't know, within limits. But
We'll get round to the
anyway,
phenomenology of spirit one day.
it might be a while building ourselves up to it. But anyways, thank you all for listening. My name is Alex.
And I'm Louis.
And this has been Ideas Matter Podcast. We'll see you next time.
See ya.